They Ask Evans by Agatha Christie. Chapter 1. The Accident. Bobby Jones teed up his ball, gave a short preliminary waggle, took the club back slowly, then brought it down and through with the rapidity of lightning. Did the ball fly down the fairway straight and true, rising as it went and soaring over the bunker to land within an easy mashy shot of the 14th green? No, it did not. Badly topped, it scudded along the ground and embedded itself firmly in the bunker. There were no eager crowds to groan with dismay. The solitary witness of the shot manifested no surprise, and that is easily explained, for it was not the American-born master of the game who had played the shot, but merely the fourth son of the vicar of Marchbolt, a small seaside town on the coast of Wales. Bobby uttered a decidedly profane ejaculation. He was an amiable-looking young man of about 28. His best friend could not have said that he was handsome, but his face was an eminently likeable one, and his eyes had the honest brown friendliness of a dog. "I get worse every day," he muttered dejectedly. "You press," said his companion. Dr. Thomas was a middle-aged man with grey hair and a red, cheerful face. He himself never took a full swing. He played short, straight shots down the middle, and usually beat more brilliant but more erratic players. Bobby attacked his ball fiercely with a niblick. The third time was successful. The ball lay a short distance from the green, which Dr. Thomas had reached with 2 creditable iron shots. "Your hole," said Bobby. They proceeded to the next tee. The doctor drove first, a nice straight shot, but with no great distance about it. Bobby sighed, teed his ball, re-teed it, waggled his club a long time, took back stiffly, shut his eyes, raised his head, depressed his right shoulder, did everything he ought not to have done, and hit a screamer down the middle of the course. He took a deep breath of satisfaction. The well-known golfer's gloom passed from his eloquent face, to be succeeded by the equally well-known golfer's exultation. "I know now what I've been doing," said Bobby, quite untruthfully. A perfect iron shot, a little chip with a mashie, and Bobby lay dead. He achieved a birdie 4, and Dr. Thomas was reduced to 1 up. Full of confidence, Bobby stepped to the 16th tee. He again did everything he should not have done, and this time no miracle occurred. A terrific, a magnificent, and almost superhuman slice happened. The ball went round at right angles. "If that had been straight—" "Whew!" said Dr. Thomas. "If!" "Hello, I thought I heard a shout. I hope the ball didn't hit anyone." He peered out to the right. It was a difficult light. The sun was on the point of setting, and looking straight into it, it was hard to see anything distinctly. Also, there was a slight mist rising from the sea. The edge of the cliff was a few hundred yards away. "The footpath runs along there, but the ball couldn't possibly have travelled as far as that. All the same, I did think I heard a cry. Did you?" The doctor had heard nothing. Bobby went after his ball. He had some difficulty finding it, but he ran it to earth at last. It was practically unplayable, embedded in a furze bush. He had a couple of hacks at it, then picked it up and called out to his companion that he gave up the hole. The doctor came over towards him, since the next tee was right on the edge of the cliff. The 17th was Bobby's particular bugbear, as you had to drive it over a chasm. The distance was not actually so great, but the attraction of the depths below was overpowering. They'd crossed the footpath which now ran inland to the left, skirting the very edge of the cliff. The doctor took an iron and just landed on the other side. Bobby took a deep breath and drove. The ball scudded forward and disappeared over the lip of the abyss. "Every single dashed time I do the same dashed idiotic thing." He skirted the chasm, peering over. Far below the sea sparkled, but not every ball was lost in its depths. The drop was sheer at the top, but below it shelved gradually. Bobby walked slowly along. There was, he knew, one place where he could scramble down fairly easily. Caddies did so, hurling themselves over the edge and reappearing triumphant and panting with the missing ball. Suddenly Bobby stiffened and called to his companion. "I say, Doctor, come here. What do you make of that?" Some 40 feet below was a dark heap of something that looked like old clothes. "By Jove, somebody's fallen over the cliff. We must get down to him." Side by side the two men scrambled down the rock, the more athletic Bobby helping the other. At last they reached the ominous dark bundle. It was a man of about 40, and he was still breathing, though unconscious. The doctor examined him, touching his limbs, feeling his pulse, drawing down the lids of his eyes. He knelt down beside him and completed his examination. Then he looked up at Bobby, who was standing there feeling rather sick, and slowly shook his head. "There's nothing to be done. His number's up, poor fellow. Back's broken. Well, I suppose he wasn't familiar with the path, and when the mist came up he walked over the edge. I've told the council more than once there ought to be a railing just here. Well, I'll go and get help. Make arrangements to get the body brought up. It'll be dark before we know where we are. Will you stay here?" "Yes." "There's nothing to be done, I suppose?" "No, nothing. I won't be long. The pulse is weakening fast. He'll last another 20 minutes at most. Just possible he may recover consciousness before the end, but very likely he won't. Still, yes, rather, I'll stay. You get along. If he does come to, there's no drug or anything." The doctor shook his head. "There'll be no pain. No pain at all." Turning away, he began rapidly to climb up the cliff again. Bobby watched him till he disappeared over the top with a wave of his hand. Bobby moved a step or two along the narrow ledge, sat down on a projection of the rock, and lit a cigarette. The business had shaken him. Up to now he'd never come in contact with illness or death. What rotten luck there was in the world! A swirl of mist on a fine evening, a false step, and life came to an end. Fine, healthy-looking fellow, too. Probably never had a day's illness in his life. The pallor of approaching death couldn't disguise the deep tan of the skin. A man who had lived an outdoor life. Abroad, perhaps. Bobby studied him more closely. The crisp curling chestnut hair just touched with grey at the temples, the big nose, the strong jaw, the white teeth just showing through the parted lips, then the broad shoulders and the fine sinewy hands. The legs were twisted at a curious angle. Bobby shuddered and brought his eyes up again to the face. An attractive face, humorous, determined, resourceful. The eyes, he thought, were probably blue. And just as he reached that point in his thoughts, the eyes suddenly opened. They were blue, clear, deep blue. They looked straight at Bobby. There was nothing uncertain or hazy about them. They seemed completely conscious. They were watchful, and at the same time they seemed to be asking a question. Bobby got up quickly and came towards the man. Before he got there, the other spoke. His voice was not weak. It came out clear and resonant. "Why didn't they ask Evans?" And then a queer little shudder passed over him. The eyelids dropped, the jaw fell. The man was dead. Chapter 2. Concerning Fathers. Bobby knelt down beside him. There was no doubt. The man was dead. A last moment of consciousness, that sudden question, and then the end. Rather apologetically, Bobby put his hand into the dead man's pocket and, drawing out a silk handkerchief, spread it reverently over the dead face. And there was nothing more he could do. Then he noticed that in his action he had jerked something else out of the pocket. It was a photograph, and in the act of replacing it, he glanced at the pictured face. It was a woman's face, strangely haunting in quality. A fair woman with wide-apart eyes. She seemed little more than a girl, certainly under 30, but it was the arresting quality of her beauty, rather than the beauty itself, that seized upon the boy's imagination. It was the kind of face, he thought, not easy to forget. Gently and reverently he replaced the photograph in the pocket from which it had come. Then he sat down again to wait for the doctor's return. The time passed very slowly, or at least it seemed so to the waiting boy. Also, he'd just remembered something. He'd promised his father to play the organ at the evening service at 6 o'clock, and it was now 10 minutes to 6. Naturally, his father would understand the circumstances, but all the same he wished he'd remembered to send a message by the doctor. The Reverend Thomas Jones was a man of extremely nervous temperament. He was par excellence a fusser, and when he fussed, his digestive apparatus collapsed, and he suffered agonizing pain. Bobby, though he considered his father a pitiful old ass, was nevertheless extremely fond of him. The Reverend Thomas, on the other hand, considered his fourth son a pitiful young ass, and with less tolerance than Bobby, sought to effect improvement in the young man. "The poor old governor, he'll be ramping up and down. He won't know whether to start the service or not. He'll work himself up till he gets that pain in his tummy, and then he won't be able to eat his supper. He won't have the sense to realise I wouldn't let him down unless it were quite unavoidable. And anyway, what does it matter? But he'll never see it that way. Nobody over 50 has got any sense. They worry themselves to death over tuppenny-halfpenny things that don't matter. They've been brought up all wrong, I suppose. Now they can't help themselves. Poor old Dad. He's got less sense than a chicken." He sat there thinking of his father with mingled affection and exasperation. His life at home seemed to him one long sacrifice to his father's peculiar ideas. To Mr. Jones the same time seemed to be one long sacrifice on his part, ill understood or appreciated by the younger generation. So may ideas on the same subject differ. What an age the doctor was! Surely he might have been back by this time. Bobby got up and stamped his feet moodily. At that moment he heard something above him and looked up, thankful that help was at hand and his own services no longer needed. But it was not the doctor. It was a man in +4s whom Bobby did not know. "I say, is anything the matter? Has there been an accident? Can I help in any way?" He was a tall man with a pleasant tenor voice, and Bobby could not see him very clearly, for it was now fast growing dusk. He explained what had happened while the stranger made shocked comments. "There's nothing I can do? Get help or anything?" Bobby explained help was on the way, and asked if the other could see any signs of its arriving. "Well, no, there's nothing at present." "You see, I've got an appointment at 6. "And you don't like to leave?" "Well, no, I don't quite. I mean, the poor chap's dead and all that, and of course one can't do anything, but all the same." He paused, finding it as usual difficult to put confused emotions into words. The other, however, seemed to understand. "I know, look here, I'll come down, that is, if I can see my way, and I'll stay till these fellows arrive." "Would you?" "You see, it's my father. He's not a bad sort, really, but things upset him. Can you see your way? It's a bit more to the left. Now to the right. That's it. It's not really difficult." He encouraged the other with directions until the two men were face to face on the narrow plateau. The newcomer was a man of about 35. He had a rather indecisive face, which seemed to be calling for a monocle and a little moustache. "I'm a stranger down here. My name's Bassington French, by the way. Came down to see about a house. I say, what a beastly thing to happen." "Did he walk over the edge?" Bobby nodded. "Bit of a mist got up. It's a dangerous bit of path." "Well, so long. Thanks very much. I've got to hurry, you see. It's awfully good of you." "Not at all. Anybody'd do the same." "Can't leave the poor chap lying?" "Well, I mean, it wouldn't be decent somehow." Bobby was scrambling up a precipitous path. At the top he waved his hand to the other, then set off at a brisk run across the country. To save time he vaulted the churchyard wall instead of going round to the gate by the road, a proceeding observed by the vicar from the vestry window and deeply disapproved of by him. It was 5 minutes past 6. The bell was still tolling, though. Explanations and recriminations were postponed until after the service. Breathless, Bobby sank into his seat and manipulated the stops of the ancient organ. Association of ideas led his fingers into Chopin's funeral march. Afterwards, more in sorrow than in anger, as he expressly pointed out, the vicar took his son to task. "You cannot do a thing properly, my dear Bobby. It is better not to do it at all. I know that you and all your young friends seem to have no idea of time, but there is one whom we should not keep waiting. You offered to play the organ of your own accord, and I did not coerce you. Instead, faint-hearted, you preferred playing a game." Bobby thought he'd better interrupt before his father got too well away. "Sorry, Dad," he said, speaking cheerfully and breezily, as was his habit, no matter what the subject. "Not my fault this time. I was keeping guard over a corpse." "You were what?" "Keeping guard over a blighter who stepped over the cliff. You know, the place where the chasm is, by the 17th tee. There was a bit of mist then. He must have gone straight on and over." "Good heavens, what a tragedy! Was the man killed outright?" No, he was unconscious. He died just after Dr. Thomas had gone off. But of course I felt I had to squat there. I couldn't just push off and leave him. Then another fellow came along, so I passed the job of chief mourner on to him and laid it here as fast as I could. Oh, my dear Bobby, will nothing shake your deplorable callousness? It grieves me more than I can say. Here you have been brought face to face with death, with sudden death, and you can joke about it. It leaves you unmoved. Everything, however solemn, however sacred, is merely a joke to your generation. Bobby shuffled his feet. If his father couldn't see that, of course you joked about a thing because you felt badly about it, well, he couldn't see it. It wasn't the sort of thing you could explain. With death and tragedy about you, you had to keep a stiff upper lip. But what could you expect? Nobody over 50 understood anything at all. They had the most extraordinary ideas. I expect it's for war, thought Bobby loyally. It upset them. They'll never get straight again. He felt ashamed of his father and sorry for him. "Sorry, Dad," he said, with a clear-eyed realization that explanation was impossible. The vicar felt sorry for his son. He looked abashed, but he also felt ashamed of him. The boy had no conception of the seriousness of life. Even his apology was cheery and impenitent. They moved towards the vicarage, each making enormous efforts to find excuses for the other. "I wonder when Bobby will find something to do. Wonder how much longer I can stick it down here." They were both extremely fond of each other. Chapter 3. A Railway Journey. Bobby did not see the immediate sequel of his adventure. On the following morning he went up to town, there to meet a friend who was thinking of starting a garage, and who fancied Bobby's cooperation might be valuable. After settling things to everybody's satisfaction, Bobby caught the 11:30 train home 2 days later. He caught it, true, but only by a very narrow margin. He arrived at Paddington when the clock announced the time to be 11:28, dashed down the subway, emerged on number 3 platform just as the train was moving, and hurled himself at the first carriage he saw, heedless of indignant ticket collectors and porters in his immediate rear. Wrenching open the door, he fell in on his hands and knees, picked himself up. The door was shut with a slam by an agile porter, and Bobby found himself looking at the sole occupant of the compartment. It was a first-class carriage, and in the corner facing the engine sat a dark girl smoking a cigarette. She had on a red skirt, a short green jacket, and a brilliant blue beret, and despite a certain resemblance to an organ-grinder's monkey, she had long, sorrowful eyes and a puckered-up face. She was distinctly attractive. In the midst of an apology, Bobby broke off. "Why, it's you, Frankie! I haven't seen you for ages." "Well, I haven't seen you. Sit down and talk." Bobby grinned. "My ticket's the wrong colour." "That doesn't matter. I'll pay the difference for you." My manly indignation rises at the thought. How could I let a lady pay for me? "It's about all we seem to be good for these days," said Frankie. "I'll pay the difference myself," said Bobby heroically, as a burly figure in blue appeared at the door from a corridor. "Leave it to me." She smiled graciously at the ticket collector, who touched his hat as he took the piece of white cardboard from her and punched it. "Mr. Jones has come in to talk to me for a bit. That won't matter, will it?" "It's all right, your ladyship. The gentleman won't be staying long, I expect. I shan't be round again till after Bristol." "What can be done with a smile?" said Bobby, as the official withdrew. Lady Frances Derwent shook her head thoughtfully. "I'm not so sure it's the smile. I rather think it's father's habit of tipping everybody 5 shillings whenever he travels that does it." "I thought you'd given up Wales for good, Frankie." "Ah, my dear, you know what it is. You know how mouldy parents can be. What with that and bathrooms in the state they are, and nothing to do and nobody to see, and people simply won't come to the country to stay nowadays. They say they're economizing, and they can't go so far. Well, I mean, what's a girl to do?" Bobby shook his head, sadly recognizing the problem. "However, after the party I went to last night, I thought even home couldn't be worse." "What was wrong with the party?" "Nothing at all. It was just like any other party, only more so." It was to start at the Savoy at 8:30. Some of us rolled up about 9:15, and of course we got entangled with other people, but we sorted it out about 10, and then we had dinner, and after a bit we went to the Marionette. There was a rumour it was going to be raided, but nothing happened. It was just so moribund. And then we drank a bit, and then we went to the bull ring, that was even deader, and then we went to a coffee stall, and then we went to a fried fish place, and then we thought we'd go and have breakfast with Angela's uncle and see if she'd be shocked. But she wasn't, only bored. And then we sort of fizzled home. Honestly, Bobby, it isn't good enough.
I suppose not, said Bobby, stifling a pang of envy. Never in his wildest moments did he dream of being able to be a member of a Marionette or the bull ring.
His relationship with Frankie was a peculiar one. As children, he and his brothers had played with the children at the castle. Now they were all grown up, they seldom came across each other, and when they did, they still used Christian names. On the rare occasions when Frankie was home, Bobby and his brothers would go up and play tennis. But Frankie and her two brothers were not asked to the vicarage. It seemed to be tacitly recognised it would not be amusing for them. On the other hand, extra men were always wanted for tennis. There may have been a trace of constraint in spite of the Christian names. The Derwents were perhaps a shade more friendly than they need have been, as though to show that there was no difference. The Joneses on their side were a shade formal, as though determined not to claim more friendship than was offered them. The two families had now nothing in common, save certain childish memories. Yet Bobby was very fond of Frankie, and was always pleased on the rare occasions when fate threw them together.
"I'm so tired of everything, aren't you?"
"No, I don't think I am."
"Oh, my dear, how wonderful."
"I don't mean I'm hearty," said Bobby, anxious not to create a painful impression. "I just can't stand people who are hearty."
"Oh, I know, they're dreadful."
They looked at each other sympathetically.
"By the way, what's all this about a man falling over the cliffs?"
"Dr. Thomas and I found him. How did you know about it, Frankie?"
"Saw it in the paper. Look."
She indicated with her finger a small paragraph headed "Fatal Accident in Sea Mist." The victim of the tragedy at Marchbolt was identified late last night by means of a photograph which she was carrying. The photograph proved to be that of Mrs. Leo Cayman. Mrs. Cayman was communicated with and journeyed at once to Marchbolt, where she identified the deceased as her brother, Alex Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard had recently returned from Siam. He had been out of England for 10 years and was just starting upon a walking tour. The inquest will be held at Marchbolt tomorrow. Bobby's thoughts flew back to the strangely haunting face of the photograph. "I believe I shall have to give evidence at the inquest."
"How thrilling! Oh, I shall come and hear you."
"I don't suppose there's anything thrilling about it. We just found him, you know."
"Was he dead?"
"No, not then. He died about a quarter of an hour later. I was alone with him."
"Rather grim,"
said Frankie, with that immediate understanding that Bobby's father had lacked. Of course he didn't feel anything.
"No?"
"But all the same, well, you see, he looked awfully alive. That sort of person. Rather a rotten way to finish. Just stepping off a cliff in a silly little bit of mist."
"I get you, Steve,"
said Frankie, and again the queer phrase represented sympathy and understanding.
"Did you see the sister?"
"No, I've been up in town 2 days. Had to see a friend of mine about a garage business we're going in for. You remember Badger Beeden?"
"Do I?"
"Of course you do. You must remember good old Badger. He squints." Frankie wrinkled her brows. "He's got an awfully silly kind of laugh. Haw, 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 like that." "Fell off his pony when we were kids. Stuck in the mud, head down. We had to pull him out by the legs."
"Oh, I know now. He stammered."
"He still does."
"Didn't he run a chicken farm and it went bust?"
"That's right."
"And then he went into a stockbroker's office and they fired him after a month."
"That's it."
"And then they sent him to Australia and he came back?"
"Yes."
"Bobby, you're not putting any money into this business venture, I hope?"
"I haven't got any money to put in."
"Well, it's just as well."
"Naturally, Badger's tried to get hold of someone with a little capital to invest, but it's not so easy as you'd think.
When you look around you, you wouldn't believe people had any sense at all."
The point of these remarks seemed at last to strike Bobby. "Look here, Frankie, Badger's one of the best, one of the very best."
"They always are."
"Who are?"
"The ones who go to Australia and come back again." How did he get hold of the money to start this business? Or an aunt or someone died, left him a garage for 6 cars with 3 rooms over, and his people stumped up £100 to buy second-hand cars with. You'd be surprised what bargains there are to be had in second-hand cars. I bought one once. It's a painful subject. Don't let's talk of it. What did you want to leave the Navy for? They didn't axe you, did they? Not at your age?
Bobby flushed.
Eyes, he said gruffly. You always had trouble with your eyes, I remember.
I know, but I managed to scrape through. Then Foreign Service, a strong light and everything, you know. That rather did for them. So, I had to get out.
Grim?
There was an eloquent pause. All the same, it's a shame. My eyes aren't really bad, and they won't get any worse, they say. I could have carried on perfectly.
They look all right.
She looked straight into their honest brown depths.
So you see, I'm going in with Badger.
First luncheon!
Oh, shall we?
They passed along to the dining car. Bobby made a short strategic retreat during the time when the ticket collector might be expected. We don't want him to strain his conscience too much. But Frankie said she didn't expect ticket collectors had any consciences. It was just after 5 o'clock when they reached Silem, which was the station for Marchbold.
The car's meeting me. I'll give you a lift.
Thanks.
It'll save me carrying this beastly thing for 2 miles.
He kicked his suitcase disparagingly.
3 miles, not 2.
Well, 2 miles if you go by the footpath over the links.
Oh, the one where...
Yes, where that fellow went over.
I suppose nobody pushed him over, did they?
Asked Frankie as she handed her dressing case to her maid.
Pushed him over? Good Lord, no. Why? Well, it would make it much more exciting, wouldn't it?
Chapter 4. The Inquest. The inquest on the body of Alex Pritchard was held on the following day. Dr. Thomas gave evidence as to the finding of the body. "Life was not then extinct?" asked the coroner. "No, the deceased was still breathing. There was, however, no hope of recovery. Here the doctor became highly technical, and the coroner came to the rescue of the jury. "In ordinary, everyday language, the man's back was broken." "If you like to put it that way," said Dr. Thomas sadly. He described how he'd gone to get help, leaving the dying man in Bobby's charge. "Now, as to the cause of this disaster, what is your opinion, Dr. Thomas?" "Well, I should say that in all probability, failing any evidence as to his state of mind, that is to say, the deceased stepped inadvertently over the edge of the cliff. There was a mist rising from the sea, and at that particular point the path turns abruptly inland. Owing to the mist, the deceased may not have noticed the danger and walked straight on, in which case 2 steps would have taken him over the edge. There were no signs of violence, such as might have been administered by a third party. I can only say that all injuries present are fully explained by the body striking the rocks 50 or 60 feet below. There remains the question of suicide. That, of course, is perfectly possible. Whether the deceased walked over the edge or threw himself over is a matter for which I can say nothing." Robert Jones was called next. Bobby explained he'd been playing golf with the doctor and had sliced the ball towards the sea. A mist was rising at the time, and it was difficult to see. He thought he heard a cry, and for a moment wondered if his ball could have hit anybody coming along the footpath. He decided, however, that it could not possibly have travelled so far. "Did you find the ball?" "Yes, it was about 100 yards short of the footpath." He then described how they'd driven from the next tee, and how he himself had driven into the chasm. Here the coroner stopped him, since the evidence would have a repetition of the doctor's. He questioned him closely, however, as to the cry he'd heard or thought he'd heard. "It was just a cry." "A cry for help?" "Oh, no, just a sort of shout, you know. I wasn't, in fact, sure I heard it." "A startled kind of cry?" "That's more like it," said Bobby gratefully. "Sort of noise a fellow might let out if a ball hit him unexpectedly." "Or if he took a step into nothingness when he thought he was on a path." "Yes." Then, having explained that the man actually died about 5 minutes after the doctor left to get help, Bobby's ordeal came to an end. The coroner was by now anxious to get on with a perfectly straightforward business. Mrs. Leo Cayman was called.
Bobby gave a gasp of acute disappointment. Where was the face of a photo that had tumbled from a dead man's pocket? Photographers, thought Bobby disgustedly, were the worst kind of liars. The photo obviously must have been taken some years ago, but even then it was hard to believe that that charming, wide-eyed beauty could have become this brazen-looking woman with plucked eyebrows and obviously dyed hair. Time, thought Bobby suddenly, was a very frightening thing. What would Frankie, for instance, look like in 20 years' time? He gave a little shiver. Meanwhile, Amelia Cayman of 17 St. Leonard's Gardens, Paddington, was giving evidence. Deceased was her only brother, Alexander Pritchard. She had last seen her brother the day before the tragedy, when he announced his intention of going for a walking tour in Wales. Her brother had recently returned from the East. Did he seem in a happy and normal state of mind?
Oh, quite. Alex was always cheerful.
As far as you know, he had nothing on his mind?
Oh, I'm sure he hadn't. He was looking forward to his trip.
There have been no money troubles or other troubles of any kind in his life recently?
Well, really, I couldn't say as to that. You see, he'd only just come back. Before that, I hadn't seen him for 10 years, and he was never much of a one for writing. But he took me out to theatres and lunches in London and gave me 1 or 2 presents. I don't think he could have been short of money. And he was in such good spirits that I don't think there could have been anything else.
What was your brother's profession, Mrs. Cayman?
Well, I can't say I rightly know. Prospecting is what he called it. He was very seldom in England.
You know of no reason which should cause him to take his own life?
Oh, no, I can't believe he did such a thing. It must have been an accident.
How do you explain the fact that your brother had no luggage with him, not even a knapsack?
Well, he didn't like carrying a knapsack. He meant to post parcels alternate days. He posted one the day before he left with his night things and a pair of socks, only he addressed it to Derbyshire instead of Denbighshire, so it only got here today.
Ah, well, that clears up a somewhat curious point. Mrs. Cayman went on to explain how she had been communicated with through the photographers whose name was on the photo her brother had carried. She had come down with her husband to Marchbold, and had at once recognised the body as that of her brother. As she said the last words, she sniffed audibly and began to cry. The coroner said a few soothing words and dismissed her. Then he addressed the jury. Their task was to state how this man came by his death. Fortunately, the matter appeared to be quite simple. There was no suggestion that Mr. Pritchard had been worried or depressed, or in a state of mind where he would be likely to take his own life. On the contrary, he had been in good health and spirits, and had been looking forward to his holiday. It was unfortunately the case that when the sea mist was rising, the path along the cliff was a dangerous one, and possibly they may agree with him that it was time something was done about it. The jury's verdict was prompt. We find that the deceased came to his death by misadventure, and we wish to add a rider that, in our opinion, the Town Council should immediately take steps to put a fence or rail on the sea side of the path, where it skirts the castle. The coroner nodded approval. The inquest was over.